Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to yet another Decline and Fall show, coming to you at least twice this week. We hope you all enjoyed the very interesting interview that we did with Professor David Miller earlier this week about the decline and fall, shall we say, of your party, not my party, but your party, apparently, though that is subject to legal action at the moment. So be sure to go and check that out, because what that interview demonstrates is one of the things that we really want to do with this channel, which is enable you, good listeners and viewers and enjoyers of the Decline and Fall show, to actually understand the networks of power that operate in the Anglo-American Empire. And these are the networks of power which draw upon a certain phrase that was said a long time ago by former CIA director and Ronald Reagan's campaign chair, William Casey, who once observed that the job of him and his kind would be done when everything that the American people believed to be true was false. Now, it's worth just lingering on that point before I throw over to my comrade and co-host in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, because when I was perhaps more naive in my younger days, I used to think that quote meant that Casey wanted everybody to believe in Reaganism and right-wing stuff. Now I'm a little older, and we know things about how the Anglo-American Empire operates in its, so we say, public perception management, narrative construction, and political fakery. What this actually means is that you have an entire spectrum of so-called debate on the right and the left, which is all fake, which is all managed by the same group of ruling class and state actors who control these narratives and push everybody down a controlled right side and a controlled left side and have them all fight it out while still dwelling in the lower reaches of Plato's cave. Now, we, of course, aim to bring you out of the cave and into the sunlight. And talking of which, as an ideal moment to throw over to Kit Clarenberg in the still sunny once a few Yugoslavia.
Yeah, I mean, Sonny is putting it mildly. I'm slowly roasting to death here. Still, it's nearly October weather. Please stop harassing me in this manner. But in all seriousness, yes. If you haven't for whatever insane reason checked out our interview with David Miller, I think that what our objective is to not only challenge establishment narratives, but also try and unpick the networks which spans politics, media, civil society, culture, quote unquote, that is bringing you this particular worldview, which you may unwittingly and entirely forgivably fall into believing. At least in part, on occasion, because it is so expansive and ubiquitous, and that might sound rather pompous, but yeah, as ever, it is a delight that you've joined us for this show. I think we've got quite the banger lined up for you, if I do say so myself. So why don't you get the ball rolling, Alex?
Well, those of you who live in the Western world may be familiar with the fact that there was a certain assassination which took place a couple of weeks ago, which involved the killing of, I think the best way to describe him is a right-wing influencer, head of Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk, with a death which is shrouded in mystery in terms of the actual crime itself and who committed it, how they committed it and why, more on that later, but also the motivations of who might have done it. We've had a series of rather strange statements from the Israeli Prime Minister, a certain Benjamin Milakovsky, for that is his real name, who suddenly started denying that Israel had killed Charlie Kirk, which is rather odd when he started saying this when almost nobody had said that they had. Bit of an odd one. I think Benjamin's losing his touch in his old age. But we have a number of revelations coming out, particularly from Max Blumenthal at the Grey Zone, about the weeks and months leading up to the death of Charlie Kirk and the potential role of, shall we say, very high-profile pro-Zionist billionaires in the US. So, Kit, why don't you outline to us where the story has got to thus far?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I've said this before, and I will repeat it again because it doesn't get any less true. The murder of Charlie Kirk, it very much appears like a kind of crap JFK assassination tribute act. We've got a magic bullet. Which allegedly he was shot from the front, but there was no spray of blood behind him. There was no exit wound because he was a man of steel with incredible bone strength, allegedly, and his body stopped the bullet. We have bizarre, and I would say quite clearly fabricated evidence implicating the shooter, the alleged shooter. As with Oswald, as with Sirhan, who absolutely didn't shoot RFK Senior, as with Arthur Bremer, who absolutely didn't shoot what was his name, George Wallace. Like it just the amount of incriminating evidence pointing away from the official narrative just keeps expanding and multiplying. And I think that, I mean, perhaps if J. Edgar Hoover was still in charge of the FBI, they would have done a better cover-up job of this. I think the key things that jump out to me are, we at the Grey Zone, we have spoken to a large number of people within Charlie Kirk's direct circle, for want of a better term. Many of them are absolutely terrified. And with good reason. And what kept cropping up in conversations with people who understandably want to remain anonymous and nameless was that there was significant controversy among TPUSA backers, amongst Trump's backers, and just more generally the evangelical right wing of America, which is hugely influential, courtesy of William Colby and Ronald Reagan, the aforementioned, that in the last months of his life, Charlie Kirk started making rather muted criticisms of Israel. A lot of this was not related to the fact that they are committing the 21st century Holocaust in Gaza. It was free. It was centered around free speech. So it's like, well, okay, this slogan has been banned, or wearing Palestinian flag badges on college campuses has been banned. And that's a free speech issue, which Charlie Kirk took some issue with. He certainly wasn't sympathetic to the Palestinians at all, and I don't think that his followers or supporters were either. But he nonetheless, given his role as a kind of major influencer among younger American generations who almost universally condemn what Israel is doing in Gaza and also now the West. Even his muted criticisms of Israel were quite problematic. Now, on September 15th, my friend's comrade, collaborator, Max Blumenthal, he published a report based on discussions with anonymous sources, that Bill Ackman, who's this kind of notorious Zionist money man, very wealthy, very influential, that over this past summer he arranged a influencer retreat. That's a vision of hell for me, but in the Hamptons. And currently, during this, the supposed thrust of this meeting was to discuss the grave threat to Western civilization posed by Zoran Mamdani becoming a mayor of New York. Mamdani having previously made statements in solidarity with Palestine, which he has since completely repudiated. And allegedly, per these sources, Ackman personally confronted Kirk during this influencer retreat in the Hamptons to take him to task over his recent comments about Israel. And there was he presented Kirk with a detailed list of transgressions and sins against the Zionist entity that he'd perpetrated in recent months. And the public face of UK Lawyers for Israel, which is this deranged hardline Zionist lobby group currently under investigation by the UK Charity Commission and the UK Solicitors Regulation Authority because of its insane non-legal arguments and lobbying activities to try and neutralize Palestine solidarity in schools, in hospitals, in universities, in private workplaces. Apparently, its public face, an individual called Natasha Horsdorf, allegedly was screaming in Kirk's face over the temerity with which he had lively criticized the genocide in Gaza and criticism of Israel. Now, the initial reaction to this report was a large number of people said, "Oh, well, the grey zone's using anonymous sources. This story is total bullshit." Number one, the grey zone almost never, ever would use anonymous sources. A lot. By contrast, the mainstream media does this all the time. There's quite clearly independent media is held to different standards than the mainstream English language media. But even more crucially, after we published this report, a large number of people who'd actually attended this summit in the Hamptons, which absolutely did happen, came out of the woodwork offering mealy-mouthed weasel accounts of what happened, saying, "Yeah, well, we did go to this Ackman-arranged meeting. There was discussion about various issues. If Charlie was screamed at, we didn't see it." Which is not particularly convincing. One individual who was extremely evasive when one attendee, who was extremely evasive when Max spoke to him on the phone, justified this on the basis that he was wine drunk and hopping on a boat in Italy. Or wine. Or wanker. Sorry, I'm sorry. But yeah, the point is that it's quite clear that the knives were out for Charlie for his yes, again, very, very, very kind of quotidian criticism of what Israel is doing. And it must be stressed that the UN has repeatedly found that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. I mean, it's just inarguable at this point. And Trump has made comments to the effect that the Israel's activities are harming his support. This is why one of many reasons, on top of her total unsuitability for any office above maybe administrator, is one of the reasons that Kamala Harris lost, and she admits this in her tell-all book about her god-awful failed presidential campaign. She acknowledges that Israel and her failure to truly condemn the Gaza genocide and offer any resolution to this was why she lost. Now, it's hurting Trump as well. I'm sure that young MAGAites are not particularly well disposed towards Muslims, but what they're doing is objectively disgusting, irrespective of who's on the receiving end. It is a televised Holocaust. 24/7, and so yeah. Since then, since Max published his story on the 15th of September, we've had more people come forward. They've told us that another major pro-Israel Turning Point USA donor ended all financial support for the organization, Charlie Kirk, in the days before his death. Now, I'm not saying that's smoking gun concrete proof that Israel was behind his assassination, but the fact that former Mossad chiefs, and indeed, yes, a certain Benjamin of Polish descent, have felt the need to challenge our reporting in the mainstream media, or issue public video statements. Netanyahu posted this video statement to Twitter, or X, in which he looked extremely guilty. And I even saw hardcore pro-Zionists suggesting that he was protesting too much, by responding to our investigations into this. So, I mean, that in itself is quite suspicious. And I as we've discussed discussed previously on the show, do check out our initial program on this. I like Kirk's assassination. If nothing else, it came at a very useful time. It came at a time when, like Trump is under significant fire for what he's doing domestically and overseas. Both by his multitudinous detractors, but also by even his own base of supporters. It came at a time when the Democratic Party is basically collapsing. It gave them an opportunity to say, well, Trump's going to institute fascism in America and we can save you from it, because Trump's immediate response to Kirk shooting was, I'm going to deploy the National Guard to every major city in America because of the threat of Antifa and the left. It led to calls within his administration and pushes to pass legislation to ban people from entry for pro-Palestinian views, to prescribe Antifa as a terrorist organization, to undertake the remarkable and just draconian step of denying citizenship and revoking the passports of people who have the wrong opinions. So it served a lot of purposes, indeed.
Yes, there's several things there to come back on, but I want to just start by addressing a criticism that's been directed at the Grey Zone's reporting on this by American leftists mainly, which is that, oh, well, why on earth would Israel or elements in the US kill someone like Kirk, who is such a big supporter of theirs? And here, I want to take a step back and draw from your JFK comparison, but also what happened to Richard Nixon, because when you're discussing things like the JFK or the RFK assassination, and people generally say, "Oh, well, why would there be a conspiracy to kill him? He was like an anti-communist, a pro-capitalist, came from a establishment family," all of which is true. But what people who put forward those points of view, and including over the Kirk assassination, miss, is that the ruling class is not always a particularly rational group of actors. I mean, just look at the way capitalism behaves in general. It has to destroy itself almost every decade in order to remake itself. This isn't a rational group of players. And if you're familiar with the way that even just your standard Zionist goes completely insane if criticized even in the infinitesimally smallest possible way, the idea of a reliable ally of theirs suddenly uttering the tiniest criticism is too much for them. They can't handle it. Like, if you try and argue with the Zionists in the street, as many of us have done, they immediately go nuts, start screaming, and start yelling for the police or threatening physical violence. Now, imagine that, but in the form of Bill Ackman, a completely delusional billionaire sociopath, and all of his friends. But by the way, I cannot imagine a worse weekend on earth than being trapped in the Hamptons with those.
Yes, it's my idea of hell. Like I said, like I genuinely, I think that hell is that forever, with wine drunk people.
Oh God, the wine would be the least up there, I think. But I think being consumed by the three-headed satanic beast in Dante's lowest circle of hell in perpetuity would be preferable to a weekend with Bill Ackman. But just to go back to the point, the reason why, like, ruling class factions, and we should always bear in mind that there are many different factions inside the ruling class and inside the state machine of the United States, as there are in Britain and everywhere else. The reason why these factions would kill a JFK, or would depose a Nixon, or would kill perhaps a Charlie Kirk, is that they see these people as their servants. And if their servants start to not please them, well, what do you do with a servant who is no longer of any use to you, or you feel has become disloyal? Well, the answer in the case of like JFK is, well, we'll kill him. The answer in the case of Nixon, who had been a very dedicated anti-communist, always was, but who started to get the idea that he was actually responsible for making real decisions over the future of the United States, and wanted to, and did ultimately withdraw from Vietnam, all of which was way too much for like what I would call the sort of fascistic militarist clique, who are also very pro-Zionist, who basically run U.S. foreign and defense policy and have done for many, many years. This is the same group that like James Jesus Angleton was like central to. And so when we talk about like the U.S. state, we have to bear in mind that like there is a formal state and an informal state. There is the face of power that you see, which tries to appear unified, and then there is all the different elements behind the scenes who are in a war with each other quite a lot of the time, fighting for influence, and often seeking to eliminate each other's assets in constant power struggles. That's why and when you get more destabilization, it's when you get irrational outbursts, like the assassination, perhaps, of Charlie Kirk, a man who remained very right-wing, remained pro-Trump, but his whole career was based on Zionist money. So if the Zionist investors suddenly felt that their asset had turned bad, well, maybe certain decisions were made, maybe they weren't. We don't know at this stage, but certainly a lot of people, including a certain elderly Polish gentleman who lives in Tel Aviv, seems to be acting a lot more guilty than would need to be the case had they not done this. So when you are looking at these events, always bear in mind, we're not dealing with a group of people who are acting in a purely rational fashion. We're dealing with people who are feeling increasingly insecure, who are feeling like they're losing the propaganda war because they are, who are feeling like even in the US itself, even amongst people who describe themselves as right-wing, they're starting to lose ground, which they haven't been close to losing this amount of ground for over 50 years. So, and then you get the general decline in US power anyway, and you've got the kind of atmosphere where such things like this can happen. And so now, shall we turn to a certain Mr. Milakovsky of Tel Aviv and his rather strange statement, because I think it's worth just sharing this. Yeah, absolutely. I'll play from the beginning. Let's just make sure we are. Yeah, we're all good. Okay, let's go.
Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, sly, the faster it will spread. Fabricated, a monstrous big lie that Israel had cursed horrific murder. This is insane. It is false. It's outrageous. Charlie Kirk was a giant. Freedom, defended America, defended our culture and civilization. Charlie loved Israel. He loved the Jewish people. He sent me just a few months ago. Latest joys as a Christian, he said, is advocating for Israel and forming alliances with Judeo-Christian civilization. He encouraged me to make the case directly to the American people about how vital Israel is to U.S. national security. He told me, the Holy Land is so important to my life. It pains me to see support for Israel slip away. I disagreed with a policy of mine or a decision here and there. Not only did I not mind, I welcomed it. This is the essence of Charlie. It's exactly what Charlie stood for. And I knew that his suggestions always came from the heart, from his love for Israel and from his. A few weeks before his death, I invited him to visit Israel again. And that won't happen. Now some are peddling these disgusting rumors, perhaps out of obsession, perhaps with Qatari funding. What I do know is this: Charlie Kirk was a great man, and a great man deserves honor, not lies. Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk. May your memory be a blessing.
Well, I was muted there. That certainly sounds like a man who has absolutely nothing to hide in any way and is perfectly capable of putting together an entirely rational response to the Grey Zone's reporting. It's sort of strange thing, because like Netanyahu is a world figure with, like, apparently huge responsibilities, and yet he takes the time to issue a personal rebuttal to a grey zone report, which I'm sure he would claim, oh, nobody reads them anyway. So somebody seems to be getting a bit twitchy. So either he's guilty as fuck and is covering something up, or he knows very well that the reputation of Israel inside the United States is in the fucking toilet, and that many millions of people, will readily believe that he and the Israeli state and their collaborators in the US would publicly assassinate somebody they thought it was in their political advantage to do so.
Yeah, well, and I think I might add as well that, like, there has been a lot of. Interestingly, I saw a very prominent MAGA person went from condemning Charlie Kirk's again muted criticisms of Israel as a repulsive blood libel, to rubbishing any suggestion that he had turned against Israel at all within a matter of weeks, post Charlie Kirk's death. But I mean, again, to stay on the JFK analogy, it's like even the impression that Kennedy was going to withdraw from Vietnam. This is like a huge source of contention and debate by historians, by assassination researchers. They're very split on this issue. But I mean, that's almost the wrong question to ask, because, like, I mean, ultimately, if powerful elements within Mossad, within the CIA, within the wider Anglo-American imperial structure perceive that Kennedy was going to, or had any intention of doing so, that would be grounds for neutralizing him, as would his very real and well-documented aversion to Israel getting nukes, for instance. And there have been some in the latest declassified files released under Trump's executive order. There are all sorts of interesting tidbits about how Kennedy was very, very, very concerned about Israel getting nukes. Didn't want the Israelis to get them, and didn't believe that the conclusions of official inspections of the Dimona nuclear power plant, that it was purely for domestic civilian use rather than for producing nukes. And he was right. Israel did indeed have a nuclear program, but if you step out of line at all, then you are a marked person one way or another on certain key issues, issues that can often not be talked about except outside the context of this show, Alex. But yeah, I mean, I think that just more generally as well is I think that similarly we call it the divergence, or it takes anti-imperialist takes on the Israel-US relationship, and this applies, as we'll get into, to Europe too. Is, well, there's a certain faction who believes, oh well, Israel controls the US. Often these people are quite anti-Semitic. That there is another faction who believes that that Israel is purely a US puppet. Actually, things are a lot more complex than that. And ultimately, it is a client-patron relationship, and frequently patrons can become captured by their clients, and vice versa. Right, so it's not as black and white a question, and I think that yes, that any deviation by Kirk from the agreed script, which is Israel is this fledgling underdog democracy surrounded by evil, Islamic tyrannies who detest Jews and want to genocide them again, and it's acting itself there. That is the stock line. Any deviation from that would be seen as deeply dangerous. And you mentioned Kamala Harris, like a core component of her campaign was that people spoke up to such as AOC CIA, saying that, oh well, Kamala has fought tirelessly to end this genocide. She didn't do anything at all, and the Biden administration kept on giving Israel weapons to mutilate and murder women and children, innocent women and children, in the most horrific manner imaginable. But even that impression was sufficient to give Trump and the Israeli lobby ammunition to claim, oh, well, Kamala supports Hamas. And so...
Well, if she supported Hamas, she might have won.
Indeed, irony of ironies. But it's like, the point is that, like, irrespective of what Kirk's actual position was and why he was making these criticisms, why he was critical of Israel, it is very clear that the knives were out for him as a result. And this is exactly what sunk Corbyn. It's exactly what neutralized Labour under his leadership, as we discussed with David Miller. Again, if you haven't seen that interview, do check it out. That he dared step out of line on an issue which is basically unquestionable and indomitable, which is lockstep support for the Zionist entity. You can offer muted criticisms at absolute best of the leadership. You can criticize Netanyahu, but the fundamental question of whether Israel has a right to exist, which it quite plainly doesn't, that cannot be broached. Him stepping out of line, Corbyn stepping out of line in the mildest way on this was the key to his destruction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's worth just mentioning or getting into the further discussion at this stage about the usage of Israel and what power that gives the Israeli leadership. So, like, it's mentioned, the Wall Street Journal ran an article the other day saying Trump privately fumes about Netanyahu, but gives him a blank check in public. So I'm just showing that on the screen now so we can all see it. This is very similar to, the stories that were published under Biden, saying Biden's privately furious. Go back 30 years, you'll be Clinton is privately furious. I think that's all true to a certain extent. Everyone who has to deal with Netanyahu for more than 5 minutes fucking hates him, because he's a phenomenally obnoxious individual for a start. But also, he has a massive amount of arrogance about him when he's dealing with U.S. presidents, because he knows something about the way the U.S. runs. He understands the way the U.S. runs better than U.S. presidents do. Because remember, Benjamin Milakovsky, as is his real name, grew up in the United States. In fact, apparently has at least one U.S. Social Security number to his name, possibly more. And he is a product of the U.S. But more than that, he represents a certain faction within the United States that is, I would argue, roughly the same group, albeit with changes in personnel, who were behind most of like the ultra reactionary happenings in U.S. and international political affairs post World War II. We're talking people who are like pro-fascist, wildly militaristic. Anti-communism is their absolute religion, which is like the thing that unites them more than anything else. And also, of course, they are very much in favor of the colonization or neo-colonial control over central areas of the world on behalf of the United States and the bloc that the US leads. Because lest we forget, and part of our analysis that we put forward on this show, this is an Anglo-American empire, which is sort of run partially from the US, partially from London, but with its colonial outposts playing an important part. Now, because the ruling group in Tel Aviv have always been linked in to the most reactionary, the most despicable, and the most criminal elements inside the US. And because the Tel Aviv regime does a load of dirty work for the US and the British, it must be said, including committing war crimes in Central America in the 1980s, where the US officially wasn't allowed to go, there goes the Israeli regime. So in Nicaragua, for instance, or I believe in Guatemala as well, the Israeli forces were involved in training death squads when the US was not formally by Congress allowed to do it. Same is true for who ran a lot of the Iran-Contra stuff. A lot of it was run by Israeli operatives and, by the way, Saudis as well. The other key part of that relationship. I remember 20 years ago when people were trying to understand the network of connections around 9/11, like some people focusing on the dancing Israelis, some people focusing on the Bush family's connection with the Saudi regime and the Bin Laden family directly. Truth is, this is all one thing. Yeah. These aren't working against each other. Well, sometimes they do, but mostly this is one nexus of power which revolves around like Wall Street, the big oil companies, the big defense companies, the various powerful individuals with both financial and ideological ties to the Israeli project, and of course financial ties to the Saudi regime. This is the nexus of power through which the US Anglo-American imperialism moves itself in the Middle East. And if Israel goes down, I'll just conclude my contribution on this point. If Israel goes down, as the late Hassan Nasrallah understood, that's it for Anglo-American imperialism in the Middle East. It's over. So Israel is phenomenally important. The Israeli prime ministers have access to the highest levels of power inside the United States. And Netanyahu, he's been around way longer than any U.S. president or even any U.S. permanent official. He is linked into the most powerful, dangerous, reactionary structures inside the United States. And he has a lot of friends who will do his bidding and the bidding of people associated with him. So the reason why he can afford to be as arrogant as he is because he understands the way the U.S. works in a way that all the American presidents, maybe except George H.W. Bush and maybe except Richard Nixon, have not done. And that gives him a level of power influence, which it's important to understand why he has that. But I'll throw back to you, Kit, for your take.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I'd like to give a shout out to Aaron Good, who is the author of American Exception and the host of the similarly identically named podcast, which is well worth checking out. Is that you got to bear in mind that as I and Wyatt Reed reported to the Grey Zone, like Israel became a special quote unquote account for the CIA after the CIA's creation. And James Angleton is very spooky figure who crops up in all manner of skullduggery and probably was almost certainly responsible one way or another for JFK's assassination. He not only built up Mossad as an agency by bringing predominantly Soviet Jewish emigres to the US to learn the tricks of the trade, and he trained them outside formal CIA structures. He also created his own private spying network and kept all but the CIA leadership cut out of what he was doing. In many cases, the CIA head honchos didn't even know what he was doing, and that basically the Aaron Good's thesis or kind of theorizing on this is that a lot of CIA work was farmed out to Mossad because Angleton was extremely paranoid and believed that the CIA had been heavily penetrated by the KGB at all levels. So all manner of very sensitive CIA operations, including ZR Rifle, which was as its name might imply, a assassination program, was farmed out to the Israelis to do. Again, the recently released newly declassified files have all sorts of nuggets about how Israel acquired nukes. It has a fully unredacted transcript of Angleton's comments to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, where under intensive grilling about whether Israel had ever tried to illegally source nuclear material from the US, he prevaricated, he offered mealy-mouthed answers, and then when under intensive questioning, he just said, "Oh well, can we go off record?" So it's like, yeah, there is a kind of a very nebulous blob of Anglo-American power with particular proxies and puppets, to the extent that you don't know, and it's not immediately clear who's running what. And I think that feeds in quite neatly to our next section on the totally not a color revolution in Nepal, where in the as we discussed in our last live stream, Nepal in recent weeks has descended into total chaos, and there has been the election, if you can even call it that, of an interim leader who doesn't have any apparent Western connections, and has a kind of unimpeachable record as a revolutionary. Her name is Shashila Karki. And she was elected Nepal's interim prime minister on September 12th via the highly unorthodox and completely unprecedented expedient of an online vote via Discord, which is this chat platform primarily used by gamers. Anyway, the point is Karki has a history of battling corruption in Nepal, and also she was jailed for her anti-monarchy, because Nepal until the early 90s was ruled by an absolute monarchy, and a very brutal one at that. She was jailed for her anti-establishment agitation. Her husband, likewise, he hijacked a plane to steal lots of money to fund armed resistance against the monarchy. Her installation as Nepal's leader has led some commentators to suggest that, well, this isn't a color revolution because she has no Western connections and she has this very impressive kind of revolutionary resume. But very quickly, it appears that a number of individuals with connections to this alphabet soup of intelligence cutouts like USAID, NED, other Western intelligence connected foundations are filling her interim cabinet. And so even if we take the view that the uprising in Nepal was wholly organic and legitimate and fueled by the justifiable concerns and complaints of younger Nepalese citizens, they have served as a spearhead for the installation, with military backing, of a Western-backed government in a state that borders India and China, who are now, public enemy number one for the US empire.
Well, I think it's, again, worth emphasizing what actually goes on in a lot of these cases, where the Nepal is similar to a place like, different part of the world, but like similar to what happened in Armenia, similar to what happened in Ukraine, which is that in Nepal, the NGO machine, the machinery of the NGO system, it has been growing and growing and growing there for in the case of USAID, it's over 70 years. But since they got rid of the monarchy, in actual fact, it seems that the role of the NGOs in the government expanded. And we covered this last week, but I want to re-emphasize it. You might have had a communist party in power, But how much power that they actually had by the end is questionable, given that every ministry had USAID, NED, Soros-aligned foundation people at the top of it. Just the same way as in Ukraine prior to 2014, the economic policy was not set by the Ukrainian government. It was set by various different actors, mainly from the West, who were already dictating what could and couldn't be done. So by the time the time comes then to deliver the killing blow. So in Nepal, you had a series of communist parties and the Nepali Congress Party nominally in power, but the ministries all essentially being run by the West through these NGOs, which is the kind of outsourced imperialism that the British are so fond of, the Americans too. So by the time these protests arrive, the work's already been done, because the state essentially has already been captured by these elements. So the Gen Z protests are just the last element needed to push out these communists from power, who nominally had party membership numbers in in the hundreds of thousands, but who could do nothing, it would seem, for reasons I'm not fully appraised of yet, to stop this sort of implosion of their authority, because their authority had already gone. This is the point. This is why those who are looking to resist color revolutions need to do some of the things that the Georgian government started to do, and others, which is get rid of the NGOs, get the foreign influence out of your government ministries, get it out of your education system, get rid of anybody who's sitting there in a position of authority, who's exercising power in your system, who is not accountable to the government and not accountable even to their direct management line of the civil service bureaucracy, but accountable to a foreign power, basically. So this is, it's what happened in Armenia. It's how the Pashinyan group got in, which is that the Armenian state allowed this growth, this ballooning of the NGO industrial complex inside the country until the power of the state had already been usurped. Just as with the Maidan, yes, it took the violent overthrow of the government there, but all those networks had been allowed to grow all over the state and so-called civil society to the point where it's relatively easy then to pull the state apart. And it's why there can be no compromise with these organizations. It's why you can't indulge them for a minute, no matter what face they put on, no matter whether they say they're there to do literacy and numeracy programs for, the peasantry or something, or governance programs, whatever the fuck that means. Usually that means, an MI6 guy with a fancy title. But like the Nepali case shows, you can't have anything to do with them. You have to throw them all out all at once, and then hopefully you're prepared to live with the consequences. Because if you're not, then eventually they will pull the noose tight on you, which is what's happened to Nepal now. And I'll just conclude on this point. All of those people in Kathmandu who were protesting, who perhaps had real reasons to be there, well, none of those reasons will be addressed by what's to come. What's to come will be reducing Nepal to the status of a vassal of the US, Britain, and maybe Germany and the EU as well.
Indeed. And it's and I think that this is, I myself, again, shameless plug, it wouldn't be a Decline and Fall broadcast without a shameless plug. I wrote about the very clear insinuations of Western support for what went down, or what has gone down in Nepal since the start of September. I got some pushback from people who were part of the protests, who said it was ludicrous to suggest that they themselves were in any way Western directed. That may be true, but the overall picture points to very clearly to a color revolution, and it's you got to bear in mind that over and over again we have seen this happen. where legitimate grievances are exploited by the aforementioned alphabet soup of Anglo-American intelligence cutouts to install governments that are considerably worse than what preceded them. And it's like, in you mentioned Georgia. Georgia, in the wake of Georgia's independence, you can even call it that, from the Soviet Union in the early 90s. It was led by a kind of very pro-Western individual called Eduard Shevardnadze, and he was, a ideal puppet. But when he tried to move towards warmer relations with Russia, which were his relations with Moscow were extremely poor throughout his tenure as leader. Suddenly, the West starts mobilizing civil society organizations, and indeed, Shevardnadze's voluntary opening of Georgia's political space for US aid and NED to get their hooks into civil society and set up all sorts of NGOs that lobbied for new laws, greater freedoms, greater transparency. This was used against him to install an even more perfect puppet in the form of Mikhail Saakashvili. This opened the door for overt military training of Georgia's army, the overriding purpose was to create this perpetual agitator on Russia's border. Such was Saakashvili's confidence in his unconditional, unbending Western backing. He effectively started a war with Russia in September 2008, which did not end well. There can be little doubt that there were people among the throngs that overthrew Shevardnadze who wanted change, who had legitimate grievances, who wanted something different to what they were, a different system to that they were living under. And the results were absolutely disastrous, to the extent that even Foreign Policy magazine has lamented that all of the color revolutions in the early 2000s, which were overtly US backed and proudly US backed, were quote unquote terribly disappointing in terms of what they produced. And I think, we're seeing this play out in Nepal now. And it's like, yeah, okay, so they got Karki, who's this revolutionary figure who's like kind of unimpeachable in terms of her political background. But then suddenly her government is now being filled with all of these figures with ties to NED, Western governments, etc. And, even the fervent backers of the palace revolution that occurred, who believe it to be wholly legitimate and organic, have acknowledged that there are very serious problems, and that Nepal is at a precipice where there is a very real prospect that they will just end up being a military dictatorship, or indeed a monarchy again. I noted this in my investigation, that a particularly suspect aspect of the negotiations between the quote unquote Gen Z protesters who toppled Nepal's government and the military is that the military is seeking to include in discussions about the shape of Nepal's future politics, people who are very pro-monarchy, who are very pro-Western, and given that the revolution in Nepal is entirely contingent on the military sign-off, it is likely that these figures will have significant influence in Nepal's future, and what they want is diametrically opposed to the demands of Gen Z protesters. And it is almost all but inevitable that Nepal will end up with a far worse leader, a far worse government, and a far worse system than that they sought to overthrow.
Well, yes, and I will also add that this goes all the way back to the so-called like Velvet Revolution and the overthrow of the people's democracies of the East of Europe. Particularly, I'll focus on Poland because this comes up a lot. The CIA and MI6 poured many hundreds of millions, I think, into like building up Solidarność or Solidarity and its wretched union leader Lech Walesa as this great hero. But it must be emphasized that the Polish socialism had a lot of problems, some of which were related to external. A lot of the workers who joined the Solidarity strikes in 81 didn't want the end of socialism in Poland. They were, in fact, all the discussions that were recorded taking place inside Solidarity, most of the system, but that wasn't who the leaders were listening to. The leaders were in the employ of actors, including mainly Britain and British and US imperialism. So what the disorganized mass of workers who were protesting against aspects of like the Polish system wanted and what they got were two completely different things. In fact, all the opinion polling of the people who turned out to protest Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia as it was then, to protest against the people's democratic governments that existed then, they wanted some modified version of socialism. What they got was capitalism at gunpoint, basically. What they got was asset stripping and destruction. Because in the end, it almost doesn't matter what a disorganized group of people want if the driving force behind it all is a group of reactionaries funded by and organized by external intelligence services. Because those are the people who are actually in charge. Those are the people with the powerful external connections. Those are the people who create and make up the new government, who will make all the decisions and will force them on to the disorganized masses who thought they were getting one thing, and it turns out they've got something else entirely. And that's been repeated over and over and over again because the US, the British, and others learned how to disguise having their hand in things. They learned how to operate behind fluffy sounding or even revolutionary sounding organizations so that they could actually appeal to people. They're not going to come out and run the old butcher's apron up the flag anymore. It's much more subtle than that these days, or at least it is and has been. So people should bear in mind that this, much as with the assassination of like JFK, removal of Nixon that we were discussing earlier, it's never just look at the surface of things. You have to understand the dynamics driving it underneath. And so a long time ago, the US and the British, they learned how to co-opt the aesthetics. They learned how to train people to make them think they were participating in a revolutionary process, whereas in actual re-enslaving their nation. But you need to dig deeper into these organizations, and this is what, of course, this show is here to do for you.
Yeah, I think, just to round this out. I mean, there, as you mentioned, the all of the groups who were much venerated in the West for opposing their governments in the Warsaw Pact, like Solidarity or Charter 77 in the then Czechoslovakia, they've openly stated that what they were seeking to build was a society which retained all of communism's benefits, except with the political freedoms that were preached by the West and under the Helsinki Accords. And they wanted economic equality, They wanted protect, guaranteed employment, guaranteed housing, etc. What actually transpired was they were thrust into this new world where homelessness, unemployment, access to healthcare and education was limited, and this was just all of these societal ills became completely commonplace. They had what many people would regard as righteous personal missions, but that's not what came about. And we are already seeing that this is the direction that Nepal is heading, which is a real shame. On the subject of being careful what you wish for, in Syria, we have had a flood of bizarrely mainstream news reports ever since HTS seized power, amply indicating that HTS, which supposedly gave up its connections to ISIS and Al Qaeda, but never actually did. They are doing everything that people like you and I, Alex, said that the removal of Assad would result in. HTS is seeking normalization of relations with Israel, despite the fact that Israel keeps attacking them and seizing their territory. They are carrying out bloody massacres of religious and ethnic minorities. They are their leaders are having chummy photo sessions and sit-down chats with MI6 and CIA operatives. We've had over a decade of people saying Syria must be free, Assad must go. Well, that's now happened, and that entire chorus is now silent because what replaced Assad was awful. And this was widely predicted, and it's now playing out again in real time.
Well, this is what it was always going to be. This is the thing. I mean, we discussed again earlier this week in our interview with Professor David Miller the way in which forces like the YPG were sold to Western left face of the Syrian revolution. Turned out that it was the acceptable face of the Syrian counter-revolution. Now, I am now about to say several rather controversial things, which I'm sure will get us that we still have in the audience out there. But the fact is that the Assad government was, certainly a flawed entity, no doubt about that. But what it was flawed in terms of its flaws, most of all, the biggest flaws were that it was unable to totally crush this foreign invasion as soon as it got started. If anything, one can argue that the biggest flaw of the Assad government was it made far too many concessions to these people in the immediate years preceding the US, British, Turkish, Israeli and mass intervention there. And again, to go back to what I was saying about Nepal, if you go back and you read the histories of like the presidency of Bashar al-Assad leading up to 2010, what starts to happen due to extreme pressure from external and internal factions is that Assad made a number of concessions, not over recognition of Israel, that must be said. He refused to do that. He persistently refused to do that, to his great credit. But did make concessions on things like what are called by some neoliberal economic policies, started to roll back what had been called under his father the sort of Syrian Arab socialism, which is what the Ba'ath Party, which was the ruling party in Syria, traditionally stood for, started to take World Bank and IMF prescriptions on policy. Well, what happened? An economic slowdown, unemployment spiked, And who was there ready and waiting to take advantage of that? Well, it was this guy. He's currently sat there with David Petraeus, but by no means just him. He's just the puppet they've chosen to stick in the Damascus presidential palace. But here's the point. When a socialist or Arab nationalist government starts to do things to try and make nice with the West does not want to make nice with you. The West wants to make a sandwich out of you. And this is what they have done with Syria. So if you can criticize the Assad government for anything, it's not, horrible, repressive stuff like that. It's that they thought that they could, much like Gaddafi did, they thought that they could reach some sort of bargain with imperialism. You can't. You can't. You can never bargain with these people because they require your total destruction unless you're prepared to essentially turn your nation into a whorehouse, with exclusive patronage being given to the US, the British, and the Israelis, and Mr. Erdogan. Then you are going to be destroyed, and this is what happened in the end to Syria, and that is the great tragedy. A sovereign and independent country that was pursuing an independent path of development has been destroyed, and it has been replaced by this horrendous MI6, CIA, Turkish, Israeli-run abomination, which is, of course, delighting the likes of David Petraeus, who, of course, remains steadfastly wrong about everything, but gets to sit on stage with Mr. Jelani, and, of course, a certain Sir Richard Moore of MI6 fame, who couldn't help but delight in the recently, just 4 days ago, actually, delight about the operation that the MI6 had carried out in Syria. And of course, why wouldn't he? In the end, it was a very successful operation there, the one which reduces the Syrian nation to abject misery, of course, and slavery. But of course, from the British point of view, it's great. And as you've covered before, Kit, this puts people like, Jonathan Powell et al., Tony Blair, etc., back into a position of very high influence in the West Asian region, and one that I'm sure they will milk for the maximum profitability and advantage. So,
yeah, indeed, and I think that this outgoing speech by Richard Moore is really quite extraordinary because he offers very detailed accounts of supposed successes during his tenure, but then he gets a bit vague about when MI6 quote unquote forged a relationship with HTS. He says it was a year or two before they toppled Assad. So, you would think that he would know precisely when. As I've written about extensively, both for the Grey Zone and the Cradles, there were a variety of US and British intelligence operations which greatly entrenched HCS in power. They significantly enhanced HCS credibility as a governance actor in opposition-occupied territory, and they assisted HCS in seizing power. We have discussed before a firm run by Tony Blair's chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, called Intermediate, which does work for MI6, was representing HCS's interests in Western capitals and trying to shill them as the next legitimate government of Syria. And Richard Moore states, Syria is a good example of where, if you can get ahead of events, it really helps when they suddenly, unexpectedly, move at a faster pace. This nimbleness is a fundamental requirement for MI6. John Ratcliffe, CIA director, while discussing a piece of joint business, said to me recently, "You guys can really hustle," which is a euphemism for MI6 does frequently the dirty work for the CIA, and in many cases goes into business for itself in ways that Britain thinks will further the US's interests. And like I say, I've written extensively about how there were MI6 sponsored projects in HTS occupied territory, such as the White Helmets, such as the Free Syrian Police. These are entities which are heavily embedded with ISIS, al-Nusra, every extremist group you can think of, and their existence gave the appearance that HTS could replace Assad. There are some very illuminating leaked files I've reported on where there are passages which state, well, there are Syrians living in these areas who have given up on any idea of the revolution succeeding and are looking instead to the Assad government to come to their rescue. We really need to change their minds and ensure that they're still on board with the quote unquote revolution. Those same files state that HTS typically left British funded projects like the White Helmets alone in the areas they occupied, whereas they, sought to neutralize other foreign-funded forces. So, the obvious question is, was HTS leaving the White Helmets alone because they knew they were sponsored by MI6 and therefore due to a relationship between HTS and MI6, these are our guys, they're our friends, we should leave them be for our own benefit and so as to not piss off our sponsors in London. So what a deadly web we weave when we practice to deceive. And I think that there is a kind of almost literary significance to Yolani, or whatever he's calling himself now, meeting with David Petraeus, who oversaw the CIA's dirty war in Syria. It's like getting the band back together in a sense.
Well, or junior employee of the month meeting with senior management as a reward for good performance in sales, which is essentially what he's there to do. But the other point I wanted to raise at this stage with regards to this part of the world is that the US, of course, continues its campaign to try and eliminate all sources of resistance against itself and its domination, or its attempted domination of West Asia. So here we go with another clown, which this is a US envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, who made a rather startling confession recently, which we will now share with you with regard to how the US sees Lebanese so-called
left disarming Hezbollah.
It's the only people who are there. So LAF being mostly Sunnis, there are Shias, and it's a good organization. It's meaning, but it's not well equipped. Because who are they going to fight, right? We don't want to arm them. We're going to arm them so they can fight Israel? I don't think so. They're arming them so they can fight their own people.
Right. I hope you all got that, because that was Tom Barrack, obviously dumb enough and arrogant enough to make these kind of confessions on camera. So if you didn't get that, what he said was, we're not arming the Lebanese armed forces so they can fight Israel. We're arming them so they can fight their own people. Now, usually a U.S. State Department official is clever enough to dress that up. Barrack apparently is crude enough, as in the manner of many Trump appointees, just to say what everybody knows is the policy, which is that armed forces that are funded and armed by the United States and Britain are not there to actually defend the country against external threats. They are there essentially as an arm's-length colonial police force. So that's the true of Lebanon. This is why, by the way, over a decade ago, the Iraqi armed forces totally collapsed when they tried to go up against ISIS, because they weren't supposed to be drilled for that. They were there to actually act as the US and British force to maintain their control in Iraq. They weren't meant to fight anybody. They were there for repression. Now, it is also why, and this is where Barrack is wrong, if the Lebanese armed forces did try to go up against Hezbollah in a serious way, not only would it lead to a disastrous reopening of the Lebanese civil war, but in reality, they'd probably lose. And also, it would split the army because even though it is deliberately sort of built on sort of pseudo-sectarian lines in many respects, it is by no means uniform that all the Sunnis would side with like the US side. There's many Sunni Muslims and Christians in Lebanon who see correctly at this stage that Hezbollah is the only force actually stopping Lebanon from becoming another Syria. And the US knows this, which is why they are so fixated upon disarming Hezbollah, because they do want to turn Lebanon into another Syria. But I mean, that's a rather useful confession that Barak has made there. Maybe he didn't quite know what he was saying. Maybe he'd had what I think Private Eye used to refer to as a very exhausting lunch. But Kit, do you want to add anything into the?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's like, I mean, I think that you yourself have made this point, which is that, like, yeah, Lebanon's security, military, and intelligence structure is, from the West perspective, is meant to solely serve the purpose of internal repression if people get too uppity, this is an ongoing discussion, if you can even call it that, about the disarming of Hezbollah. It's never going to happen. But B, I have again written and produced investigations based on leaked documents, which show that Lebanon's security and intelligence infrastructure is heavily penetrated by the British to an absolutely extraordinary extent. I mean, there are British intelligence contractors like Torchlight, who I believe we've discussed before, who have dedicated offices in Lebanon's primary intelligence directorate, and the leaked files related to their infiltration operations boast about how they have the British have very close relationships with the senior officials within these entities, and that means they are unlikely to say no, quote unquote, to yet further British penetration. Now, the point here is, well, yeah, I mean, it actually kind of demonstrates as we've frequently quoted, what Mao said, that imperialism is a paper tiger, which is, yeah, like, okay, so sure, the British can infiltrate Lebanon's internal security forces and intelligence services and use them as forms of repression against the domestic population, but actually their ability to do anything other than that is extremely poor. And there is a company called Syrian, which is run by a veteran Northern Irish police officer. You can only imagine what he was up to during the Troubles, and they train Lebanese security forces in torture and other wicked methods, quote unquote digital extraction, which is to say, breaking encryption on people's phones and seizing all the contents of it. Actually, when it comes to actual war fighting capability, which it would be a war if they sought to disarm Hezbollah, they are completely useless. I mean, this has been ongoing for months. The US demands and British demands that Hezbollah disarm. It's not going to happen. They're never going to disarm voluntarily. The puppet states that the Anglo-Americans have created don't have the strength by design to do so. So, I mean, it's a completely pointless controversy, and it's going to lead nowhere. And these remarks are, as you say, probably more revealing than intended. Elsewhere in that conversation, the same US official said, well, one of the problems we face is that, Islam doesn't have a term for submission. So they're not going to submit voluntarily. The actual phrase Islam means submission. the Arabic term Muslims means submitters. So I mean, apparently, like a basic grasp of, Arabic and indeed, the history of the region, the history of Islam as religion, which is extremely rich, and all sorts of other topics, which you would think someone in a position of power within the Pentagon or the CIA would possess. Actually, that's not a basic requirement for reaching the highest levels of these agencies, which is, kind of ironic, to say the least. But yeah, that I think that in many ways the Anglo-Americans have painted themselves into a corner here, where the British state has of course prescribed Hezbollah's political and military wings as terrorist factions. By attempting to create an us and them dynamic and trying to ostracize Hezbollah, they've just pushed more people into their corner. It's like, well, you're forcing us to choose between internal forces of repression that you support and an independent liberation force, which actually tries to represent our interests and defend us. Well, we're going to side with the latter. Who wouldn't really?
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, this is the point that what they don't understand is that it's got, I wouldn't say it's got nothing to do with Islam, but it's like, if you want to find a Muslim who will submit to U.S. power, well, go see the King of Short. Go see the Saudi princes. Go see the rulers of Qatar, where you can bomb their country and they'll just mumble a sort of polite protest. There's plenty of Muslims who will submit to the power of the United States. It's just that the root of the problem for the U.S. is the largely working class Shia Muslim population of South Beirut and South Lebanon, who out of whom Hezbollah was birthed 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, and who have consistently resisted attempts at Israeli domination and U.S. domination ever since. And the U.S. and the Israelis have never found a way to destroy them. And this is where I'll conclude here, precisely because they are so deeply rooted in the working class areas of Lebanon. And that's where their strength is. And as long as they remain rooted there, they can't be defeated. Just the same way that the U.S. flailing around in the Caribbean and screaming at Maduro and saying that they're putting a bounty on his head won't do jack shit, because the process is about far more than one man in Venezuela. Because it is a movement rooted in the Venezuelan masses, just as killing Hassan Nasrallah was meant to destroy Hezbollah, and it didn't, because it is about much, much more than one man or even a series of men. It is about a movement that is rooted in the masses of the country who want to secure true independence and sovereignty for their nation. You can't defeat that via sanctions or via some twat with a Harvard law degree bellowing orders that he's puppets. Doesn't work, as Mr. Barak is finding out.
I think that this is something that we've discussed at length. It's something that that I've written about. Is that one of the kind of quirks and the one of the contradictions in the foundations of Anglo-American imperialism is that fundamentally, since World War II, the US has filled London's empty shoes, assuming management of far-flung crises and emergencies, and trying to master the unmasterable dual legacies of colonialism and partition, which was bequeathed to the Americans by their own former imperial overlords in London. And the British have a very a very simplistic outlook on conflicts, which is just assassinate the leader and install the king. And there are numerous declassified files in which, people like Bevin in the 1940s, when they were trying to deal with nationalist rebellions, it's like, well, can't we just kill them all and install some kind of region he'll be a puppet. That's the prescription. But it's like it shows how simplistically and actually how stupidly like the Anglo-Americans view the world. It's like, okay, so we're going to get rid of this leader and then everything will be fine. But then the actual question is, well, if we get rid of this leader, well, what comes next? And it's never about an individual. We see Russia, Putin being used as a kind of synonym for Russia in discussions about the Ukraine war. Well, get rid of Putin, you probably get someone who's considerably more hardline. And would be attacking Ukraine even harder. It's not going to result in what they desire. And yes, in Venezuela, it's not just Maduro or the progeny of Chavez. It is a huge society-wide movement against U.S. imperialism and colonization and exploitation. They have a highly mobilized, highly energized and eager civil defense force, which you would have to deal with, even in the event that you managed to one way or another wipe out Maduro. And we see this again, like in Cuba, say, where the CIA had all of this kind of obsessional determination to get rid of Castro. And it's like, okay, well, you get rid of Castro, and then you have the population, which is overwhelmingly, because Castro very wisely got rid of fifth columnists, supportive of the system in which they live, and would risk their lives to defend it. Lessons all round, I think, not least for average people in Britain and America who do want change. Don't invest all of your hopes and dreams in one particular candidate or one party. As we've to bring this full circle, as we discussed with David Miller not long ago.
Yes, and as we will go into in future special series in the On Decline of Fall, we are planning to expand what we talk about on this program into, shall we say, outlining the hidden history of old perfidious Albion and how it got into the place that it is. There are several, of course, key events to understand as to how we got into the place that we are now. And we will be covering those in future specials, which we hope that you will join us for. Thanks to everybody who supports the show via watching it. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Be sure to, and also subscribe to the Substack as well. All of that help. Share our content around. Send it perhaps to a relative who is seeking guidance. Send it to perhaps a reactionary uncle who might finally be ready to put down his copy of The Guardian. Send it to people as a sort of very economical but very rewarding Christmas gift, because the season is coming up. But thank you to all of you who have watched us this week and who support the program. We will be back with you again very soon, and I'll leave the last word to Kit over in the once and future Yugoslavia.
Well, yeah, little to add apart from God bless you for tuning in. We hope that you found this broadcast entertaining and informative as ever. And we have some really exciting specials lined up and exclusive interviews in future. So do stay tuned, like, share, subscribe. If you're feeling particularly generous, do drop us a donation of some kind. We have Buy Me a Coffee. We have subscription options on Substack. But more generally, it's just a delight to be able to bring you this information, and it is an honor and a privilege that so many people find value in our work. So God bless you. See you soon. Take care.
The Lord loves us because he gives us stupid enemies. See you again soon.